Then how does the follicle going to develop the way it goes in the ovary? What regulates the follicle development? Well, they are under the control of gonadotropin hormones, right? So if you still remember, those are the two hormones we talk about that secrete from pituitary gland, right? So that's follicle stimulating hormone. By its name, you know that it's stimulating the follicle growth in the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle refers to because every month we have this, one follicle develop into and going to be ovulating, right? And so we the average length of the cycle is 28 days. So we're going to use that number, and we position the ovulation happens right in the middle. Day 14 is ovulation. And so if we use ovulation as the basically the divider, right? So the first half of the phase of the ovarian cycle will be the follicular phase, will be the follicle become bigger and bigger under the influence of the FSH and LH. So they become bigger, and they in turn, right, they are the gonad that actually in response to the gonadotropin then generate sex hormone, and that will be estrogen. So as the follicle become bigger, you have increased estrogen level, right? And the increased estrogen level actually going to take turn. You can see towards here you have a decrease of FSH. That's because increase of estrogen level going to be negatively feedback onto the pituitary gland and hypothalamus to inhibit the secretion of FSH. Okay. But then until right before, so this will be day 13, right before ovulation, you have a spike, right? All that inhibition all of a sudden let loose, and you have a spike of FSH and even more prominent spike of luteal LH hormone, right? So then that's going to dramatically increase the size of the follicle, and therefore you have the pop of the follicle, then ovulation happens. So the spikes of the LH and FSH is a direct trigger of the ovulation. Then with the ovulation happens, then you actually end up, because then now you lost the follicle, right? And you actually have a decrease in the estrogen level, because estrogen are produced by estrogen is produced by the follicle. But then the second phase is called luteal phase, right? Luteal phase is the development of corpus luteum as the remnant of the follicles. And that corpus luteum actually going to produce estrogen, right? Not intermediate level, not as high as in the follicles production, but then more prominently it actually produces progesterone. So in the luteal phase you have both sex hormones being produced, but in the follicle phase only estrogen is produced by follicle. So those two then is going to reduce based on the once the corpus luteum regresses, right? And then the production of those two sex hormones also going to be reduced. And what's the trigger of the regression? If there's nothing happens, right, in the uterus, no embryo, no fertilization, no embryo implant into the uterus, then there's no signal to sustain the corpus luteum. Then this corpus luteum is going to regress, and so you have then drop of the sex hormones, and drop of the sex hormones then take away the inhibition effect on the pituitary hormones. Then at the very end, right, then you start to have the increase of the pituitary hormones. Then you're going to start another cycle. right? Increase of the pituitary hormones, trigger another follicle start to develop, right? And so you enter another cycle of ovarian cycle. This is a busy figure. I know you probably get overwhelmed just by looking at all the arrows, right? This is actually showing you the hormonal interactions we already alluded to in the last slide, right? So in most of the follicular phase, right, you have the gonadotropin hormone from the hypothalamus triggers the FSH, right? And FSH, remember, that's work on the follicles, right? And then promotes, the growth of the follicle, and then also in development, right, the secretion of the estrogen from the follicle. So the estrogen, when it's going to it not only secrete estrogen, but also secrete something called inhibin. And that's low level of estrogen, right? Then it's going to feedback and inhibit the further production of the FSH and LH. So that's why LSH and FSH and LH level kind of tempered off at the end towards the second half of the follicular phase because of this negative feedback. Remember that, because the level is going high, so then it's going to need to turn off the stimulation. So that's a negative kind of feedback. But you do see, if then if you go back to that, early we said, well, with negative feedback, you should be able to control a level at a certain range, right? This doesn't look like a negative feedback, right? Because if it were negative feedback, then you won't be able to see those spikes. That's exactly right. This looks like a positive feedback. And indeed, positive feedback also happens. And that's because with positive feedback, what triggers this positive feedback is when the hydrogen increases, right? I mean, the estrogen secretion increases from the follicle with the follicle growth, then it's going to actually become the high estrogen level. So it peaks pretty high. So that will be considered high estrogen level, and high estrogen level actually triggered a different feedback system, not the negative feedback at the low level. The high estrogen actually triggers a positive feedback. So now the green is stimulation. So high level of estrogen going to stimulate hypothalamus and pituitary gland to produce more LH, and that's why you have that spikes. Because then it's a positive feedback. You are quickly feed onto itself and create that spike. And that spike is going to result in ovulation, right? Rapid increase of those follicle, and then ovulation. Ovulation then when this happens, right? The estrogen level drops, then it becomes negative feedback again. Right, so then that's why at the second half, as the luteal phase, you have low FSH and LH level, because the estrogen secreted from the corpus luteum is relatively low. Right. Also, there's progesterone also secreted from the corpus luteum. All of those, in addition to the inhibin, right? Inhibin is also secreted by corpus luteum. They all work as a negative inhibitory mechanism, negative feedback onto the pituitary and hypothalamus. So then you have low level of those gonadotropin hormones in the luteal phase until the corpus luteum regress. So then you take away all those hormones, going to reduce, right? Corresponds to the regress of the corpus luteum. Then you take off those inhibition mechanism, right? Then you'll start to have the gonadotropin hormone work on the pituitary, and to have another round of the gonadotropin action. So that's the combination of both the negative feedback, right, at the low level of estrogen and positive feedback at the high level of estrogen, right? Combination of all those hormones interplay, then you result in the cycling of the pituitary hormone and also the sex hormones, right? So that's why you end up with those cycles of so they're called ovarian cycle. Well, of course, there's more to the story than just ovulation, right? In the female reproductive system, when the oocyte is ovulated, then it's going to be picked up by the uterine tube. Is by this first part of the uterine tube called the infundibulum, has this finger-like structure called fimbriae. Fimbriae have cilia, and also the uterine tube has cilia on it and cause gentle swirling of the fluid. So therefore, they can pick up the oocyte, but also can move the oocyte down the uterine tube into the uterus. In addition, the uterine tube also has muscularis, right? It's a smooth muscle layer that can produce the peristaltic contraction that also helps move the oocyte down the uterine tube. So smooth muscle layer, peristaltic contraction, right? And so the oocyte is going to end up in the uterus. The uterus itself have 3 layers, right? The endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. And the endometrium layer is the one actually also goes through cycles. So endometrium have a basal layer, has a functional layer, right? So with each cycle, right, there's also morphological change happens especially as a functional layer of the endometrium. And all that is basically to prepare for the implantation of fertilized egg, right? Early embryo. Then where does the fertilization happen? So the fertilization actually happens usually in the ampulla of the uterine tube. Doesn't really happen in the uterus. The sperm should, if they arrive in the right timing, they would swim up. They would swim across the uterus and swim up the uterine tube. They're going to meet the oocyte right here, and then the oocyte is going to continue to travel. By the time the oocyte, whether it's fertilized or not, into the uterus, right? If it's fertilized, it's going to implant into the endometrium. So all those preparation, right, cycling of growth as a functional layer in the menstrual cycle is to prepare for the arrival of a fertilized egg. But if the egg is not fertilized, then it's basically going to be degraded. So the egg can survive for about 24 hours, right, without fertilization after it's ovulated. But the sperm can survive, once they are in the body, can survive for about 3 days. So then to actually move up the stream, right, to try to find the oocyte to fertilize. So that's roughly what happens. So if the oocytes are not fertilized, right, so then not only it regress, then also the uterus are going to shed the functional layer. Because there's no signal for it to keep it. If it fertilized, it's going to implant and then into the uterus and going to start to secrete human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, HCG, and that's going to actually provide the signal to maintain the basically to maintain the corpus luteum function. So the corpus luteum is going to be sustained, not going to regress. Then it's going to continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which work on the endometrium, and then to maintain the functional layer. So then you basically stop the cycle, right? You have actually, growth, all the machinery, hormones, and structure going to be optimized for the further development of the pre-embryo, and then into embryo, and then into fetus. So we are going to talk about what happens if, fertilization happens, what happens throughout of the pregnancy, but that's going to be in next lecture. There's one structure I want to point out, is the cervix. That's basically the canal that's linking the uterus to the vagina, right? So you have the cervical canal. Then there's two structures. One is called internal os. That's the border between the uterus and cervix. And you also have an external os. That's basically the opening, right, between the cervix and the vagina. So let's look at what happens in the uterine, right? When we talk about uterine cycle, it actually lines up with the ovarian cycle, because it's under the control of the ovarian hormones, right? So it's in correspondence also 28 days, right? So the first phase is the menstrual phase. Is actually you are starting with the 5 days of shedding, because this is basically you want to shed the functional layer that you develop in the previous cycle, right? Then the second phase, the proliferative phase, you can see it actually under the influence of the estrogen level. You'll have then the proliferation of the functional layer. And then in response to the both estrogen and progesterone, right, you have your uterine enter a third phase called secretory phase. Secretory phase, you can see actually a dramatic thickening of the functional layer, development of a lot of blood vessels, that's increased vascularization, as well as development of uterine glands in the functional layer. So as mainly under the influence of progesterone, right? So they are getting ready for the pre-embryo to be implanted. If the implantation doesn't happen, right, then you are going to end up, you have the drop of the corpus luteum hormone, that's progesterone and estrogen, and that's going to trigger the shedding of the functional layer, and that will be going back to the first phase of the next menstrual cycle, that's menstrual phase. So in your textbook, you have this menstrual phase, menstrual cycle lined up with, everything else, the ovarian hormone level, the gonadotropin level, right, the development of follicles. So we could actually, you need to really, in your mind, memorize the whole thing. And to be able to tell, I could ask you using ovulation, right, as kind of the mark, right, as the first phase or the second phase. I could ask you, okay, does this happen before ovulation, or did it happen after ovulation, right? I could say, okay, development of corpus luteum, did it happen before ovulation or after ovulation? I'm referring to within this 28-day cycle, the way it is lined up in those diagrams. Okay, so if I say development of corpus luteum, that should be after ovulation, right? That's correspond to here. If I say, menstrual flow, right, menstrual phase, is it before ovulation or after ovulation? That happens before the ovulation in the time frame we are talking about, right? The way we start, because it's cycle, it could have started anywhere, but we start menstrual phase as the first 5 days in this menstrual, uterine cycle, and correspond to the whole ovarian cycle. Now I'm testing you guys. Okay, when do you think, fertilization happens? Is it before ovulation or is it after ovulation? Well, it has to be after ovulation, after the oocyte get out of the ovary, right? Get into the uterine tube, right? Also, you can do mind practice yourself. All those hallmark events. Does it happen before or after? You should be able to tell using this figure 28.7, and just to kind of test yourself. Now I want to talk about the female external genitalia to point your attention to a few of those structures that are homologous to male structure. So you have the most outside will be labia majora, that's homologous to male scrotum, and the labia minora actually homologous to the body of penis. Then you have this really sensitive part, right? Have erectile body, right? Erective tissue inside, so that's the clitoris, and that clitoris actually homologous to the glands of penis, also erectile tissue. Inside, right, if you go deeper, so this is deeper structure of the external genitalia, you have a greater vestibular gland, right, that bury underneath. It actually secretes mucin and for lubrication, and it's homologous to the male bulbar urethral gland, also secrete mucin and reduce, basically lucrative for the sperms to travel through. This is providing lubrication, right, for the male genitalia to go into the vagina during sexual intercourse. I want to spend a couple minutes talk about female sexual response. So just like in male sexual response, you have a few phases, right? You have the excitation phase, you have the orgasm phase, then you have the resolution phase. But in female, there's no refractory period. Males have a refractory period. But let's look at what regulates the female sexual response. You have both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions involved. So if you still remember from AMP1, when we talk about the autonomic, nervous system, right? That's divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And we talk about they oftentimes opposing each other. You have dual innervation, right? In a lot of the organs, and their function will be opposing each other. And back then we said there's only one exception. The exception would be as the reproductive system. And this is where we are now, right? So you have actually the sympathetic and parasympathetic division working synergistically with each other. And then, so the result would be it's going to feed onto each other. Then you have the reproductive culture become engorged with blood, right? You have the erectile tissues hardened, and then the clitoris becomes very, very sensitive to the tactile stimuli, and all those, remember the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, right? They are involved in control of your heart rate, the blood pressure, respiration rate, all that actually increases in the excitement phase. And then it's going to build onto each other. It's like a positive kind of feedback, right? Until then to produce orgasm. Orgasm then is this intense feeling of pleasure. And what's the hallmark of orgasm is the vagina and uterus contraction. It's rhythmic, right? And of course, it's not something like you can voluntarily control, right? It's autonomic system, autonomic nervous system controlled. So then after the orgasm, then you have the resolution phase. All the reproductive organs and relaxes, and the excess blood are going to leave them. So this is what happens. Essentially, the same thing happens in the male sexual response. Just the presentation is slightly different. So there's another external sexual organ, right? In female, that's the mammary glands. Right? Mammary glands, predominantly their development is during puberty, right? So then their development is under the control of the sex hormones, such as estrogen and progesterone. And during the pregnancy, though, there's further dramatic development of the mammary gland, especially under the influence of progesterone. So then they are getting ready to generate milk, right? So, and that's to get ready for lactation. And the lactation is the process that releases milk. So prolactin is this hormone that's responsible for milk production. Right? It's basically working on the mammary gland and promotes the secretion of production of the milk. But then oxytocin, another hormone called oxytocin, that's one of the posterior pituitary hormone, right? Prolactin is the anterior pituitary hormone, but then oxytocin is the posterior pituitary hormone that's responsible for milk ejection. It works on the smooth muscles that line up the ducts of the mammary gland, and so when oxytocin actually is released, is basically responsible for the milk ejection. Right? Milk get out of the mammary gland. So you need both hormones to be able to lactate. Right? If you only have one but no milk production, there's no milk coming out. If you only have prolactin but no ejection of the milk, lactation won't happen either. So we are going to actually talk about the lactation regulation later in next lecture too. Structurally, in terms of structure, mammary gland, you have nipple, the dark and pigmented area surrounding it is called areolar. And then you have within the mammary gland, right, you have lobes of, like different lobes of the mammary gland. But then you have lobule, that's the kind of the sector, right, that's, the lobules make up a lobe. Right, this big one is the lobe. Then you have lobules of the mammary gland. And so you have the collecting ducts, milk collecting ducts, that's going to converge and make lactiferous sinus. And so it's kind of stores some milk here, right? Then under the pressure of the suction, then you're going to actually basically collecting, you have the ejection of the milk from the nipple.